Vamos a continuar con la presentación de la profesora Rosemary Joyce. Rosemary Joyce is a distinguished professor of anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. She defined her research as a concerning how things make people as people make things, attending to human and non-human agency. Her books, Gender and Power in Pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, and Ancient Bodies, Ancient Lives, expanded theoretical work on sex in archaeology beyond the gender binary. In 2022, she awarded the Premio Jesús Niñez Chinchá by the Instituto Hondureño de Antropología e Historia and the A.B. Kidder Award for Eminence in American Archaeology of the American Anthropological Association. Vamos a proyectar la presentación que gentilmente Rosemary nos ha hecho llegar.
Thank you for the invitation to share with you my research on the history of women in Honduran archaeology, and specifically women who are less acknowledged in the record. Honduras is distinguished by having at least two prominent women, and second, Dorothy Popenoe, whose work preceded that of Stone, and who arrived in Honduras as the spouse of Wilson Popenoe, a botanist working for the United Fruit Company, and put her own training as a botanical illustrator to work in conducting archaeology in Honduras up till her death in 1932. Through her work, Popenoe established archaeological points of reference from across the country, beginning with work at Lanzatia, where she and Wilson were constructing a botanical garden, and marked by very important work at the site of Tenampua. Starting in 1927, she maintained contact with Alfred Merson Tauser of the Peabody Museum, and under his direction, began to direct her research towards questions that he defined as of particular importance. Materials that she collected form major collections in museums today, and her publications are among some of the most important in early 20th century archaeology of Honduras. In her correspondence with Tauser, Dorothy Popenoe began to take direction about what questions were most important for her to pay attention to. In particular, Tauser directed her attention to clarifying the chronology of developments from what he called bichrome pottery to polychrome pottery. This question of the sequence of ceramics was one that professional archaeologists at the time felt was of particular importance. And I've described it using the concept of canon formation, where a canon is a list of artistic works considered to be permanently established as of the highest quality, or in this case, of the most importance. In the professionalization of Honduran archaeology, polychrome painted ceramics that could be compared to those of the Maya lowlands had emerged as canonical objects that every museum that collected from this region needed, and that were considered to be the key to understanding the history of the archaeological sites in the country. I've noted that canon formation also involves a process of exclusion of participants in archaeology, and thus of sites and things that professional archaeologists no longer considered important. And this is critical to recognizing an even earlier history of participation by women in Honduran archaeology. From the 1890s to the 1940s, as archaeology became professionalized, a series of institutions returned repeatedly to selected regions of the country that they had defined as those that would answer the big questions that were emerging for museums and universities. Starting in the 1890s with the Peabody Museum's investigations at Copan, and proceeding with work by the Smithsonian, the High Foundation, and the Middle American Research Institute in particular, archaeological topics and archaeological themes became dominated by the professional archaeologists, all of them male, who were recognized staff of museums and universities. This led to an understanding of a more limited set of regions as important, and particularly those that might be considered to be along the Mesoamerican or Maya frontier, stretching from the Alua Valley to the Comayagua Valley. In addition to Alua polychromes, Alua marble carved vases emerged as part of the canonical material from Honduras that every museum needed to have in order to represent the cultures of ancient Honduras. But again, the formation of Alua marbles as part of the canon took place partly by excluding other related materials, including ceramic vessels and stone-carved vessels that were among the earliest objects from Honduras to make their way to museums in Europe in the 18th century. These and other materials made their way to Europe through the work of 18th and early 19th century collectors, retrospectively characterized as antiquarians. The publication for the British Museum in 1779 of carved stone vases from Honduras is the earliest systematic study of antiquities from the country. It was part of a greater emphasis in Europe in the 19th century by antiquarians on stone objects from this region, which were considered in relation to emerging concepts of the Stone Age or Neolithic in Europe. And it's here that I can identify the first cluster of women involved in collecting materials from Honduras. A group of women centered in the capital city of Comayagua, where, following independence from Spain, new enterprises, attempts at creating railroads, brought international visitors from France, the United States, and the UK to mingle with the leading families of Honduras. Victorina Berlioz, originally French, relocated to Honduras in this period and married a European railroad entrepreneur named Kirkpatrick. And through them, the British Museum gained one of its earliest chipstone objects from Honduras, seen here, described as having been excavated on farmland near Comayagua. In 1871, the family of Clara Modelli collected what I have identified as the earliest known example of an Alua marble vase still existing in museums today. Modelli did not donate this piece to the British Museum until 1931. And when she did, she made it clear that it was collected while she was living in Comayagua along with her husband, a railroad engineer, since her son was born in Comayagua. Other participants in early collecting centered on Comayagua, also women, can be traced in an exhibition and catalog from Genoa in 1892. The exhibition itself, intended to honor Christopher Columbus and described as containing objects from the Catholic missions in the Americas, solicited by the Bishop of Genoa from bishops throughout the Americas. The objects that came from Honduras include a wide range of material. Those regions shown here in orange sent materials that we can identify as archaeological, but other natural history specimens were sent from clerics throughout the country. Included in the materials submitted by the Bishop of Comayagua were two pieces. One, an Alua marble vase, the earliest illustrated in 1892, donated by Rita Aranda, Aranda was part of a major family in Comayagua, landowners whose land holdings going back to the 1850s included the land occupied by the major archaeological site, Yaromela. Also appearing for the first time in 1892 was an example of an Alua polychrome vessel, this one donated by Caterina Bulnes. Like the Aranda family, the Bulnes family were major landowners in the Comayagua Valley. In these examples, we can see a mixture of international and local prominent families engaging in collecting antiquities, presumably as part of a practice understood to be part of civilized behavior at the time. That this circle was even larger is suggested by research that I've done in archives in Great Britain at the Archaeological Museum of Cambridge University and the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford. Correspondence there from the 1890s shows an agent in geological and archaeological specimens repeatedly offering an assemblage of objects from Honduras to different patrons. This included serrated chipped stone implements of the kind that were highly prized by collectors in the UK in the 19th century, but also part of a carved stone vase sketched by the agent, demonstrating that it was an Alua marble vase. The interesting thing about this collection, turned down by both museums, is that as correspondence proceeded, the agent shifted from referring to the owner as male to referring to the owner as female, suggesting that here again we have another example of a woman, unfortunately to date still anonymous, who had connections to society in Honduras sufficient to allow her to bring out an assemblage of stone and ceramic implements. Like many other materials collected in Honduras at this time, once arrived in English-speaking territory in England, these were attributed to British Honduras, today Belize. But the presence of the Alua marble vase strongly suggests that this piece again was part of the collecting circles that included women in late 19th century Honduras. As professionalization continued between 1890 and 1940, a wide range of women actually contributed to collecting. In my database of collectors, they make up at least 10% of the people credited as responsible for donating materials to museums. Dorothy Popenoe and Doris Stone are the only two that have been recognized by archaeologists as practicing a form of scientific investigation. But they were not alone. Other women accompanied scientists on expeditions in Honduras, or sometimes even funded the work of these scientists, and end up credited as donors of collections today in museums, often ignored and largely undiscussed and unpublished. Another form of participation of women in collecting in Honduras during this time period is illustrated by the family of a U.S. consul, William Alger. Donations by Abby Alger in 1901 and her sister, Mrs. Philip Ronceville Alger, in 1923 to different museums correspond to the participation by their brother in investigations of archaeological sites when he was American consul at Tegucigalpa, Honduras. Now, we might consider this a form of extraction through participation of diplomats, not unlike E.H. Thompson's work at Chichen Itza. But what my research shows in the case of Honduras is something much more interesting. a pattern of intermarriage by Europeans and North Americans arriving in Honduras for political or medical reasons and remaining there married into local prominent families. In the case of William Alger, he becomes the ancestor of the Alger Paz family by marrying into the highly prominent Paz family of the north coast of Honduras, attesting to a second center of collecting as a social practice by prominent elites in the coastal city of San Pedro Sula. So during this period, when museums begin to form a canonical account of who was an archaeologist and what was archaeologically important, we see that women continue to participate in collecting and interpreting materials. Another very prominent example is Elena Carrillas. Elena Castillo de Carrillas, the wife of the president and multi-term dictator of Honduras, was also the patron who promoted the development of archaeological exhibitions in the first National Museum in Tegucigalpa. Her collection was photographed there in the 1930s by visitors from the Middle American Research Institute and testifies to the kind of breadth of material that Elena Carrillas collected and deposited in the museum, including what would be canonical in North American museums, Alua polychromes, but also extending to stone objects from a variety of regions. When we add the collecting activities of these women, what we get is a much broader participation in the development of Honduran archaeology by a group of people unrecognized in most histories today. And this does not end with the establishment of new antiquities laws in the late 1930s and the creation of the Institute of Anthropology and History, charged in the 1940s with the protection of Honduran antiquities. Following 1940, women continue to be sources of materials deposited in museums outside of Honduras. Some of these women describe the sources of their materials as excavations, as was the case with the material donated by Mildred Leitch in 1955. And one group in particular can be identified through the writing of Doris Stone about her reinvestigation of Tenampua as a circle of prominent women in the new capital city of Tegucigalpa who made a practice of going to nearby Tenampua and excavating in it. What I hope this brief summary of some of the work I'm doing on collecting histories in Honduras illustrates is that the participation of women is much broader than the few who are recognized as archaeologists in modern histories of Americanist archaeology. The role of prominent women associated with powerful families, landowning families, and political families is something that needs to be resurfaced not only in Honduras, but likely in many other places in the world. When we consider these people simply as antiquarians collecting things for aesthetic purposes, we ignore the possibility that for them, collections like these represented heritage and values beyond those that archaeology in the 20th century thought was important. They deserve to have their interests treated seriously and their work remembered. And I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share this work with you.
Muy bien. Hemos culminado con la presentación de la doctora Rosemary Joyce